Welcome back. Right, moving on to our first segment for today, shedding the light on President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's visit to St. Petersburg in Russia to participate in the Russia-African Summit. Well, talking about the Russia-African Summit, it was inaugurated in 2019 under the Egyptian presidency of the African Union. To discuss this in more details over the phone, we have His Excellency Ambassador Hussein Haridy, former Assistant Foreign Minister. Hello.
Good morning, madam.
Good morning, sir. So everyone now, the whole world is following with this important meeting, talking about the Russia-Africa Summit taking place in St. Petersburg. And of course, it is expected that this summit will discuss many of the challenges facing the continent. So tell us more about the importance, talking first of all, of course, about the timing of this event and also about the important challenges that we are going to discuss.
I guess Africa, African countries, African people, African governments are following this forum of Russia-Africa with great interest and concern. Interest because they expect, or they hope, to be more precise, that this forum would come up with action plans that would serve the interest of African countries. And concern, and this is related to the timing of this forum, the second edition of this forum, concern because for reasons difficult to understand, 2 weeks before the second edition of the forum, the Russian government announced that it's withdrawing from the grain initiative, the United Nations brokered grains initiative of July 2022. And such a withdrawal led to a 20% increase in the price of wheat worldwide, which has impacted badly on African economies and on Africa's food security. So as far as timing is concerned, of course, as I said, it's a major concern for African countries. And let's wait and see how would the Russian government help African countries overcome the fallout from its decision to withdraw from the grains initiative.
Right, many talks regarding economic ties and trade between Russia and Africa as well are taken into consideration. So tell us how far or what do you expect after this summit when it comes to the real economic challenges, of course, the whole world is facing, but in particular, we're talking about Africa.
Well, I personally speaking, I prefer to wait and see what will come out of this forum and whether it's practical or not. The agenda of the meeting or of the summit includes what the Russians have called the partnership between Russia and Africa for what they call food sovereignty, between commas. I interpret food, this strategy as how to provide Africa with food security. Food security today, in light of the war in Ukraine, has become a major concern internationally, whether for countries or for international and regional organizations such as the United Nations and the African Union and the European Union. So the food security, I guess, one measure, I would suggest that one measure of determining whether this meeting has been successful in meeting the needs and the interests of African countries would be to see what decisions will be taken to ensure the food security of African countries. This is a major African concern, Madam, taking into account the fact that it's not only a problem of the accessibility to the grains, which is a stake, but, and this is more important than the thing, this is whether the African countries have the financial means of meeting the increases in international wheat prices. So let us wait and see what will come out of this forum in order to judge whether it was a successful meeting or something else.
If we just take a look at the Western side, also we can see, in light of tension between Moscow and, of course, Ukraine, we can see that the Western pressure to curb some of the solutions of the summit as well.
Well, one way of looking at this forum is precisely the point that you have just raised, Madam, is this, of course, African leaders are aware that there is a competition between the United States on the one hand and Russia on the other hand, as far as their presence in Africa is concerned. And in fact, the second edition of the Russia-Africa Forum is taking place 6 months after Washington, the Biden administration, had hosted an American-African summit in Washington, D.C. last December. So African leaders are conscious of that, but they don't want, I don't think that they have no interest whatsoever to see Africa as a battleground between the superpowers. Having said that, I guess the Biden administration has come out with a comprehensive strategy of cooperating with Africa. And now it remains to be seen whether Russia would be able, taking into account the sanctions regime imposed on Russia, whether Russia would be able to compete with the United States as far as this strategy is concerned, whether Russia will have its own strategy of cooperating with Africa. Of course, and one of the agenda items of this meeting is an action plan for cooperation between Russia and Africa from 2023 till 2026. That is to say, from this second edition till the third edition in 2026. Let us wait and see, and then we can say whether this edition meets the aspirations of African people and African governments.
Right. Of course, talking about food supplies come number one as one of the main priorities when we talk about the challenges in the African continent. But also there are some other potentialities and opportunities that we can talk about, and Africa can take benefit. We are talking about mutual benefits actually between Russia and Africa as well. So what other potentialities do you see from your side?
Well, I guess we can look at it from the perspective of African development plans in the context of the African Union, and whether Russia could provide assistance, help, and know-how to African countries in implementing the goals of these various programs. If we take, for example, an African program known as the development of infrastructure in Africa. This is a very ambitious program that aims at linking African countries by whether we are speaking about roads, about railways, about links between various port cities in East and Western Africa. So we'll see, can Russia help African countries in the implementation phase, or not? Another plan, which is very ambitious, and it's called Agenda 2063. There are certain objectives, that, for example, women empowerment, youth employment, education. We'll see. These are objectives that African countries aspire to implement, to carry out by the year 2063. So the question here, of course, is whether Russia would help Africa in this regard. So I guess, of course, Africa is the land of opportunities as well as the land of challenges. And we'll see, Madam, the action plan that the Russians have included on the agenda of this meeting in St. Petersburg, concerning action plan from today till 2026. And we'll see, of course, the main elements of the strategy of this plan and the financial resources that would be allocated by the Russian government to implement this action plan.
Talking about foreign currency, if we're talking about trade between Russia and Africa, so do you think this is going to be a challenge, or we know that there are some measures to be adopted to overcome this? Let's discuss this in more details. How are they going to talk, or how are they going to deal with this challenge?
Well, the principle of adopting local currencies has been accepted. But the question remains whether it's feasible or not. Let's wait and see, Madam. If they can, I doubt very much, given the financial difficulties facing most African countries these days, whether because of the war in Ukraine or because of the raises in the interest rates. The United States Federal Reserve raised its interest rates by 0.25 base points yesterday, and it would keep raising its interest rates at least till sometime next year. So this has a very adverse effect on African finances, and given the fact that Russia is under a sanction regime, let's see how the two sides, the African countries and Russia and the Russian government, would deal with this very challenging obstacle.
Right. Of course, also this event is going on with the 80th anniversary when we talk about the 80 deeply rooted or historical relations with Russia. So, of course, this also has a significant meaning or a significance in general.
This is in terms of Egyptian-Russian relations, Madam? I didn't get this point very clear.
Yes.
Well, of course, the main event in Russia is the second edition of the Russia-Africa Forum. Yesterday, of course, there was a summit, an Egyptian-Russian summit, where the two Russian and Egyptian leaders reviewed bilateral relations between the two countries. Of course, historically speaking, Moscow, whether during the former Soviet Union or during the Putin years, Russia has provided Egypt with support, economic assistance, military assistance, and I shall let us not forget, just to remind our younger generations, that we fought the 1973 war, and we crossed the Suez Canal with Soviet-made weapons. So, of course, bilateral relations between Cairo and Moscow during the last 8 decades have seen ups and downs. The ups were more than the downs. And luckily, these days, we are in an upward trend in these relations. And this is, of course, as President Sisi underlined yesterday during the Egyptian-Russian summit, that Russia is helping Egypt build its first nuclear plan for peaceful uses of the atomic energy in order to meet its growing energy needs.
President El-Sisi also was talking in this meeting, of course, about Daba plant and the cooperation between Egypt and Russia, in addition to the projects taking place in Suez Canal and more. So I would like to discuss this also in more details to understand really how Russia now is one of our supporters in this respect, talking about mega projects and its impact on the Egyptian economy.
Well, in the last few years, Egypt has deepened its relationships with various powers. And of course, Egypt depends on such a cooperation in carrying out some important projects and in financing, to a certain extent, the implementation of these projects. And of course, we are trying to also, the Egyptian government is doing its best to attract direct foreign investment. And Russia, of course, is interested in of course, taking advantage of these opportunities, investment opportunities in Egypt. So I guess Russia not only is assisting us in building our first nuclear plant, but also in railways and in building an economic zone along the Suez Canal.
Also talking about tourism, as we know that tourism is one of our main sources or incomes. So there were talks also about bringing more Russian tourists to Egypt, giving more facilities when it comes to the foreign currency, and more about, for example, flights and packages to receive more Russian tourists. We all know that maybe a little bit the number decreased due to the economic crisis that we are all facing, but we are trying to work more on this respect as well.
Well, of course, before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, Russian and Ukrainian tourists made up a large percentage in tourism to Egypt. Of course, this has changed regrettably after February 2022. And now the two main obstacles in bringing back in large quantities Russian tourists, the main two obstacles are, of course, direct flights between Russia and Egypt, and the second obstacle is of course, the financial side, how to pay for the visits and the stays of Russian tourists in Egypt. Of course, I hope that the two governments could work out a plan whereby Russian tourists will be welcomed once again in Egypt.
Well, how do you see the impact of this meeting with the Russian side, especially that nowadays we can see many challenges taking place, people with, people against? I'm talking, of course, about the Western side.
Well, as I said earlier, madam, let's wait and see what would come out of this summit, of this meeting. Of course, the situation today is completely different from the international situation when the first edition of this forum had taken place in October 2019. And I prefer, personally speaking, to wait and see the outcome of the forum before making any medium-term predictions as far as Russian-African relations are concerned.
Well, also you were talking, Your Excellency, about women empowerment, about the youth and providing more job opportunities. And this is also another challenge that we are facing in Africa. So from your own point of view, how can we address this in more details?
Well, as I said, these are some of the objectives in Agenda 2063. African countries are committed to the implementation of this agenda. Of course, when this agenda was agreed upon, no one could have predicted the outbreak of a major war like the war in Ukraine that would pit the American-led West against Russia. And of course, the impact of this war on the well-being and on the economic resilience and the public finances of African countries have been dramatic, to say the least, madam. So, and African governments are committed to the objectives of Agenda 2063, whether Africa would be able to meet the date 2063, achieving at least 90% or 80% of the incentives of the objectives. That, of course, that I leave it to future generations. But what I can say is that women empowerment, education, job opportunities for American youth are main drivers for the economic prosperity and social stability of African countries.
And we can say that Egypt as a gate, Russia's gate to Africa in general. Well,
yeah, Egypt is a member country in the COMESA. It's an agreement between some African countries in the eastern part and the southern part of Africa. And of course, not only in this context, madam, in this framework, legal framework, Egypt, of course, as a member in the COMESA agreement and in other agreements with African countries, of course, could become the gateway to some foreign investors to Africa. It all depends on the policies we adopt and on the facilities that we provide for foreign investors, whether they are Russians or coming from somewhere else. Thank you very much, madam.
Right.
I have to leave it at that. Thank you very
Hussein
much,
Haridy,
madam.
former Assistant Foreign Minister.
Thank you
very much for joining us. And moving on to a quick break, then we'll be back with more on The Breakfast Show.